All right. Thank you, Blair. Welcome, everybody. It's certainly good to see a lot of familiar names, familiar faces. Certainly, nothing beats the nothing beats the experience of seeing you all live. But we should be getting back to that. And it's great to talk with you and have a chance to be with you here online. Those of you who haven't been getting the emails, you might not have seen, but we're going to be doing a couple of programs here as a kind of a run-up to October, where we are going to be going back to offering live courses here in Gainesville. I know a number of you know that. We've already got some of you registered, but for those of you who weren't aware, the online experience is great, but we're also very eager to get back to working with you all one-on-one. The way we're going to be structuring this today is nothing new to those of you who may have participated in some of our Next Practices Live programs that we've been running over the last year. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem that we're putting up here, and as I go, as you have questions, please don't wait until the end to address questions. You can drop them into the chat. You can raise your hand if there's something that you want to share directly. Blair, I'm going to have to ask you to kind of monitor who raises their hands. I have some stuff here on the screen, but sometimes I miss when folks raise their hands. So if somebody poses a question, somebody raises their hand, please feel free to stop me, even if it's in the middle of something. I don't really like to hold questions till the end. It's been my experience that when folks hold their questions to the end, you forget. And I don't want you to forget. If there's something that we're talking about that you'd like to contribute on, stop me. We'll figure out and go past. And then there'll be a chance later on after the presentation for some of you to maybe share some of your own particular issues, because as we're going to talk about, everybody has infrastructure gaps. No matter where you are, what country you are, there isn't a single country in the whole world that can look back and say, yes, we have all of the infrastructure that we want. Or in some cases that we need. But we're going to talk about some of those differences here today. And understanding those differences is really the key part of looking at this question of the infrastructure gap and what it means for the people. So we're going to run through a number of considerations, a number of stories. I think some are stories that have only been enhanced over the last year. As I'm going to talk about in a little bit, we tend to think of two distinct categories of infrastructure. But over the last year, those categories, the line between those categories is not as bright a line as it used to be. And I think that poses some not only interesting challenges for infrastructure provision going forward, but also gives us some new opportunities as our infrastructure works together in ways that maybe we didn't intend, in ways that we didn't understand. And that's really one of the reasons that I wanted to do this particular topic, is because I think a lot has changed over the last year. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of an infrastructure gap, what it means, what the implications are, and then what are some of the ways that we go about addressing this gap. So, one of the things with why we always worry about infrastructure is infrastructure impacts all of society, whether you're providing it, whether you're using it, whether you are implementing policy in order to make one or the other a little bit easier. It has an impact on everybody. And as all of you know, providing that infrastructure imposes challenges. But The lack of infrastructure also imposes challenges. So understanding that balance, a lot of times when we look at, oh my gosh, there are costs to providing this infrastructure, but there are costs to not providing it. You know, one of the debates going on in the United States right now is our road system and the money that it costs in order to maintain the roads. And it's a lot. But on the other hand, there are also a number of studies out there showing what the costs to people are when we don't maintain the roads. So, you know, if we're going to spend money to build up the roads, that's going to cost people. But when we don't maintain the roads, now you have more automobile maintenance. You're suffering more damage to your car. Parts are wearing out quicker. Tires are wearing out quicker because you're not spending the money on maintenance. So the question becomes, where should we be spending the money? Is it spending the money on the infrastructure, or are we better off spending money on maintaining the cars and all of that? So a lot of considerations when we talk about infrastructure. You know, if you are particularly interested in this topic, you may not have all seen this study. Those of you connected with a bank, I know you have, but Julie Rosenberg and Mary Ann Fay put out a really nice study 2 years ago now, Beyond the Gap. And this graphic is taken from that study, and on the slide here, and you guys will get the slides once we're done here today. I've got a link to the study for those of you who want to know a little bit more. But basically what they identified were the gaps for the infrastructure and quantifying those gaps. And, you know, in most of the regions, you know, there is a significant cost to narrowing the gap, and especially as you look at it in terms of the country's overall GDP. So you know, this graphic here shows the actual spending for a couple of different scenarios, and then the needed investment for what they call their preferred scenario. For more details, you can download the paper and take a look at that. But the takeaway here is that in Latin America and the Caribbean, Europe and Central Asia, Africa and the Middle East, where they did the study, you've got significant gaps between the needed investment and the actual spending. And when you look at that as a percentage of GDP, that's pretty big. I mean, when you're talking, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7% of GDP, the value of all the goods and services produced in the economy, you know, that's a tremendous amount. So, you know, what can we do? What types of things can we employ in order to narrow that gap? So, important to understand, as I said, this is a universal problem. Every country faces some sort of gap, either gaps in economic infrastructure or social infrastructure, gaps in financing. Sometimes you have the physical infrastructure in place. This is important because oftentimes we focus on the thing. You know, we need infrastructure, so we'll build a bridge, or we'll build a courthouse, or we'll build a power plant, and we focus on the thing. Sometimes the problem is in how that thing is performing. So it may not be a problem of the physical infrastructure or lacking the physical infrastructure, it's the performance. So don't overlook that part. Understand, we like the physical thing. You know, I understand the attraction of the physical thing. You know, you build it, and there's a little nameplate on the cornerstone of whatever you built, and it's got people's names on it, and people love to see their names on a plaque someplace. But don't fall into the trap of just thinking of infrastructure as the physical thing. It can be the performance as well. So we're going to talk about that too. And when we're looking at it, you know, what we're going to try to do is understand what are the costs and benefits of these gaps. Now that might make you stop for a second. Wait a minute, what? Did he just say the benefit of infrastructure gaps? I did. It's kind of an odd, grant you, a kind of an odd concept to think about, normally we think about infrastructure gaps as, oh, they're bad things. But if they were entirely bad things, probably wouldn't exist. There's enough of an economist here to say that if a gap exists, there's got to be a benefit to that gap to somebody. Those of you who've been to our courses probably had a chance to speak with or work with Karen Johnson. Karen used to be the CEO of our local utility, GRU. And Karen has a great saying where she talks about no matter how screwed up a situation is, somebody is benefiting from that. And that's the context I think we have to look at when we're considering infrastructure gaps. Because remember, ultimately, the people are going to pay all of the costs associated with this infrastructure, right? Maybe in different ways. We'll talk about some of those ways in just a minute. But there's no escaping that ultimately the people pay all of the costs. And if an infrastructure gap exists, chances are that's translating to lower costs for somebody. And it may be somebody who's not paying the price for that gap. So when we look at infrastructure, the costs and benefits of that infrastructure are not uniformly distributed across everyone. There's a difference between what one group of people might be paying, what another group of people might be paying. The benefits that one group of people are receiving versus the benefits that another group of people are receiving. So, we've got to have that understanding in place, because many times that's contributing to the gap. That non-uniform or asymmetric distribution of costs and benefits. So don't overlook that part. It's a very important piece. So it may be a little bit of a misnomer for me to say the benefit of an infrastructure gap, but the idea is that if there is a gap, that somebody is better off, maybe better off because of that gap, is important. It's important to understand if that exists. So when we're looking at the types of infrastructure, it's really important to understand what type of infrastructure we're really looking at, because that's going to it's going to either constrain or give you particular opportunities depending on the type of infrastructure. So when we're thinking, the types of things we're usually thinking about is first the idea of economic infrastructure. And when we think about economic infrastructure, the criteria we're thinking about is, does this enable commerce to take place? So, another way of looking at it is, can you charge for it? So, utilities, for example, are a common example of economic infrastructure. Airports, roads, communication networks, all those types of things we usually look at as economic infrastructure. Social infrastructure provides services of some sort to the people. So education, healthcare, law enforcement are popular examples of social infrastructure. But boy, something over the last year has really shown us is that the lines between economic and social infrastructure is getting really blurry. Over the last year, we've seen communication networks either enable or hinder access to education, enable or hinder access to healthcare. All right, so, communication now, in a lot of countries, we're facing the question, should we be looking at communication as economic infrastructure? Is it more social infrastructure? Is it a mixture between? So all of the debates that we're having about access to communication networks in certain types of communities. We're having them here in the US. I know you're having them in a lot of the countries that you're working in. Conversations happening all throughout the Caribbean, and I'm sure elsewhere. This idea of, is a communication network really economic or social infrastructure? It's hard to say, because we've seen with the amount of leaning on our communications network that we've done over the last year, we're seeing that the line is pretty blurry. So if I was giving this talk 2 years ago, we would have had a much brighter line between those two. We would have said, hey, with economic infrastructure, these are the considerations. With social infrastructure, these are the considerations. And we'll talk about that in a second. Today, with what we've learned over the last 2 years, it's a lot more difficult. So some of the things that we're going to talk about in the context of economic or social infrastructure, you may be applying them in ways that you wouldn't have thought to apply them 2 years ago. So when we look at infrastructure, one of the things that we have to consider is, what do our strategies look like for procurement? Now, the first strategy that we should always look at is this idea of public finance. What if the government goes out and secures financing for the infrastructure and puts the infrastructure in place and then ultimately runs the infrastructure? Now, I know for a lot of you, you look and say, we don't worry about that. There's no way the government can do that. So we don't even consider public finance for infrastructure. That's a big mistake. That's a big mistake. You have to at least have an idea of what it would cost for public provision of the infrastructure, because that's the only way you have a source of comparison. These different procurement options, it's really important to note that they are all tools. None of these is a goal in and of itself. And I know for a lot of you that is, seems almost trivial for me to mention that. Of course, these aren't goals. But over the last 2 years, I can't count the number of times I've read where some policymaker somewhere says that our goal is to do more public-private partnerships, or our goal is to do more privatization of this type of infrastructure. No, they're not goals. The goal is, how do we provide infrastructure in the most cost-effective manner? That's a goal. How do we provide an infrastructure system that is sustainable because it is cost-effective? That's a goal. All these other things are just tools. Public-private partnerships are a tool. Might be a useful tool, might not. Privatization might be a useful tool, might not. But all of them, to figure out whether they're cost-effective, you need something to compare them to. And the best comparison is public sector provision. So even if you have no intention whatsoever of doing public sector provision for infrastructure, you still got to know what it would cost, because that's the only way you know if privatization or public-private partnerships are cost-effective, if they provide value to the people. So that's the starting point. For all of these discussions, that's the starting point. Then, of course, we get into what some of our other options are. Private procurement, privatization. May not be an option for all types of infrastructure. There may be security concerns. There may be cultural concerns. There may be just certain businesses that you don't want in the hands of a purely private provider. That's okay, right? It's something important to note up front, but that's all right. So there may be a lot of reasons where privatization is off the table. You don't want complete private provision. You don't want them, private providers, entirely in charge of education or healthcare or law enforcement, something. So that's good, but you have to know that up front. And then public-private partnerships, another option where you get some of that private participation, you get some, some of the incentives that you get from private participation, but the asset is still ultimately owned by the public. And so that might be an important consideration. You know, might be okay for a private provider to, you know, operate a power plant, but ultimately that power plant is still owned by the people. That hospital is still owned by the people. The school is still owned by the people. You know, it's not owned by the private operator. So, you know, public-private partnerships, I'm going to talk a little bit about them because that's the one that I hear most often when folks say, we really want to do more with public-private partnerships in infrastructure. And, you know, it may be an option. The challenge with public-private partnerships, though, is that any project can be one. But that doesn't mean that every project should. You know, there are costs that are unique to a public-private partnership. Specifically, there are a lot of upfront costs, a lot of work that you have to do beforehand. And for some projects, you know, that cost isn't worthwhile. So as a result, typically we reserve public-private partnerships for large projects where, you know, the upfront costs are, you know, maybe minimal when you consider the life cycle cost of the investment. So you have huge life cycle cost of the investment. Yeah, you've got upfront costs, but in the grand scheme of things, when you're looking at cost over a 25, 30-year period, it's a relatively small amount, so you don't worry about it. But let's say, you know, an asset that maybe you only expect to last for 2 or 3 years, or an asset that's not very expensive to begin with, chances are you're not going to go through all the work that you would go through with a public-private partnership. Now, the nice idea behind a P3 is that as long as you're structuring it correctly, you can create incentives for managing costs over the entire life of the project. So you're not just looking at the cost of building the asset, you're looking at the costs over the entire life of the asset. And that creates some important incentives. What we don't want with our infrastructure is we don't want something to get built and then 5 years later, we can't use it anymore because it's fallen apart. You know, we want to build something that is going to last. It's going to provide service over the longer period of time. And the nice idea with a public-private partnership is you're creating an incentive mechanism for a company to not only build the asset, but because they also have the responsibility of operating and maintaining the asset over its lifetime, according to an incentive mechanism, usually a fixed price of some sort. Then, you know, they have a vested interest in not just building it as cheaply as they possibly can, because now they know they got to maintain it over the entire life. You know, they're basically allowed to manage. You know, they can choose to build the asset really strong and save on the maintenance costs going forward. They may build with an idea of how are we going to maintain it going forward. And that's an important partnership. You know, we've done some work in the infrastructure here at the University of Florida. And one of the things that we found is that the people who were building the buildings and the people who are maintaining the buildings at the time we did the study, they've gotten better now. But at the time we did the study, they didn't talk. So if there was a way that the building could be constructed or equipment could be located that made it easier to maintain, they didn't do that because those two groups never talked to each other. The strength of a public-private partnership is that you're making that group one entity. So they are communicating, they are working together to figure out how to manage the life cycle costs of that infrastructure. But what that means is that you have to provide the parameters up front. You know, a public-private partnership is a long-term contract. So understanding what you want out of that infrastructure, how you want service to be provided, the quality of service is critical because you have to put it all in a contract beforehand. That's why I said, you know, a lot of upfront work with public-private partnerships. But with proper structuring, you get some management incentives for costs over the life of the asset. So when we're looking at the costs, what are the types of things that we're looking at? We're looking at construction costs. We're looking at the operating expenses. And that's important. It's easy to overlook, but depending on the types of infrastructure, the U.S. Department of Defense did the first study of this back in the 70s. And they found that for some of their infrastructure, the construction costs were in some cases only 15, 20% of the life cycle cost of the asset. I mean, they spent all this time worrying about the cost to build it when you considered the life cycle, it was a relatively small percentage. So don't overlook those operating expenses. Again, depending on the infrastructure, that can be 80% of the costs. Now, there's a lot of variability there, but the idea is that these operating costs are not always considered when we're building. As I said, we like building stuff. Policymakers love building stuff, but don't overlook those maintenance costs. And realizing that ultimately sustainability of that infrastructure, all right, those costs are going to be paid over the lifetime. So, looking at those life cycle costs is important. And that's, one of the ideas behind a P3. But even if you're looking at public provision, it's important to understand that. But because those operating costs are can be such a big part of the infrastructure, when we're thinking about infrastructure provision, we might also be considering just the operation of an existing asset. All right. As I said, we like the building stuff, but if we take away that part and focus solely on outcomes, the service that is being provided to the people, right, there may be opportunities sometimes to take a facility that already exists, but to run it better, to better manage the costs of that asset going forward, improve the service of that asset going forward. So there can be benefit to the people from taking an existing structure and running it better. Tend to overlook that. Typically, when we think about infrastructure, we're always thinking build, build, build. Doesn't have to be. It can simply be taking existing infrastructure and doing a better job of managing it. But again, with that focus on life cycle costs. So once we have a handle on the costs, now we worry about the idea of the payment mechanism. And traditionally, we talk about two different kinds of payment mechanisms, like they're different in some way. And that's always interesting to me that we treat them differently. But the argument I'm going to make here is they're not quite as different as sometimes we make them out to be. So the first payment mechanism that we typically talk about is the idea of the user pays mechanism. And typically that's best implemented when we talk about economic infrastructure, utilities and airports and roads, right? Because we can charge people to use them. We can charge a toll for people to use a road. We can charge companies to use gates, slots at our airports. We can charge people to use the facilities. We can charge people for the electricity or for the water that is provided by the utilities. And the idea of a user pays payment mechanism is that best aligns with the idea that in regulation, when we talk about cost causality. If somebody is using a facility, if somebody is causing a cost to be incurred, then they're paying for that cost. And there's kind of an attractive connection there for us. It seems fair, right? Because, people are using that road, people are using that power plant, the output from that power plant, so they're paying for it. Now, sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes we have affordability concerns. And so this idea of the user pays is, there's what we call a gap, what we'll call a funding gap. And then we run into the question of how do we go about closing that funding gap, or do we close that funding gap? Sometimes if we identify the funding gap before the infrastructure is built, sometimes the project just won't go forward because we're not interested in the cost of closing that gap. So a user pays. Sometimes it's sufficient to pay all the costs to provide the service. Sometimes it's not. The other payment mechanism that we can talk about is the idea of a government pays. But that's a bit of a misnomer, because the government, what we talk about as the government, I mean, certainly it's made up of people, but the government itself doesn't have money. I mean, ultimately, the government gets its money from you, right? So lots of times we'll just kind of toss off this idea of the government pays payment mechanism, say, let the government pay for it. Now, that's really another way of saying everyone pays for it, right? Because that's who the government is getting its money from, ultimately. So you basically have a choice between a user pays mechanism, which sometimes it works, sometimes there's a gap, or an everyone pays. And there we start to get into a bit of the fairness issues. Right now, we're having a lot of debates in the United States, and I'm sure where you guys live, about how to handle utility debt related to the COVID pandemic. And a number of utilities have started to handle that debt by creating a regulatory asset that will be ultimately paid for by all of the ratepayers. So they collected the money that they could from the individual ratepayers, and then went to the regulator and say, yeah, there's still a pile of money here that we haven't been able to collect. And so we're going to we'd like permission to create a regulatory asset and charge it to everybody. And you're starting to hear some backlash here in the United States about, well, wait a minute, I paid my bill during the pandemic. Why should I have to pay for the people who didn't? So anytime we have some sort of everyone pays mechanism, we're always going to have fairness concerns. We're always going to have considerations for, why should I pay if I'm not using the service, or if I didn't cause the cost to be incurred? So that's something that we have to worry about, this idea of this everyone pays mechanism and what that means. Great example is, and a number of you, I'm sure, have seen this study. It's about 5 years old now, but still as relevant as the day they wrote it. Chris Trimble and Masami Kojima, Inez Perez Arroyo, Farhad Mohammadzeh at the World Bank put together a study of, basically they looked at costs for electric utilities in sub-Saharan Africa, and then identified the rates. And the costs here are the bars, the rates are the red dots. And you can see what they identified is that in fact, all cases but two, the Seychelles and Uganda, the rates being charged were not sufficient to cover the costs. So what's happening here? I mean, those costs are still being incurred. That money is still being paid. It's not being recovered through the tariffs, but it's still being paid somewhere. I mean, the money was actually spent, and it didn't come from thin air. So the idea here is, what happened? I mean, someone paid that. And in most cases, the someone was everybody. It just wasn't necessarily in a transparent manner. It may not be in a manner that we can identify. Your taxes went up because of X, or you didn't have certain services provided because of this. We don't know what that is, but the fact is, those costs were paid by somebody somewhere. We just had to make a decision on, who and when. So this idea of the value of the infrastructure, does it provide value to the people? It's really important when we're looking at this idea of sustainability. The people ultimately pay all the costs. All right. All the policymakers decide is how and when. That's it. And when people are being asked to pay for the infrastructure, they need to see value. And sometimes it can be difficult, to identify what's the value of having this infrastructure. A popular starting point might be, well, what are the costs of not having the infrastructure? I mentioned before the US example of the roads. Because of the poor condition of certain roads in the United States, this is what it costs drivers to drive on those roads in terms of maintenance and replacing vehicles, replacing parts on the vehicles. That might be a good first step, but you have to come up with some idea of what is the value if you want the infrastructure to be sustainable. So we got to understand the public needs. We got to understand the public costs necessary to provide the infrastructure, even if you're not going to provide it from the public. And then the cost of not providing it. And then we're looking at our procurement options. And to the extent that we can, we want to focus on our outcomes and focus on the incentives for performance. So a lot of different considerations. We have to consider the cost of the infrastructure as well as the cost of not having the infrastructure. We've got different options for provision, but understand that everything that we're talking about here is they're all tools. None of them are goals. Privatization, not a goal. P3, not a goal. They're all tools that have advantages and disadvantages, and we need to weigh the pluses and minuses of each of those tools to come up with a sustainable system that benefits the people.
Hey, Ted, there's a question in the chat room.
Oh, sure. What's the question?
Can government pay approach be an option and then indirectly charged via tariffs or taxes by people and businesses operating within that municipality where the infrastructure is located?
Yeah, that's not only an option. That's got to be one of the choices, right? The government doesn't have money of its own. Ultimately, it gets it from the people. So that's why I said, now you can focus. So I guess maybe my characterization of everyone pays, I could see where maybe that made it sound like it's indiscriminate in terms of everyone pays. Yeah, absolutely. You can target the specific folks who are going to pay, but it is they're still paying for it. So you might have a situation where, well, a perfect example is the COVID debt. Utilities went out and they recovered all they could from the people who incurred the debt. But then, for some folks, that wasn't an option. Some folks still couldn't continue to pay their bills, so they got cut off from their service. And now you have no way of collecting from those folks. So you have to make a choice. Who are we going to recover from? So here in Gainesville, GRU made the decision that, well, we're going to recover from all of the Gainesville customers. They're not recovering from people who live in Miami. They're not recovering from people who live in Tallahassee or Orlando. It's very focused, but it's recovering from the people in Gainesville. And we've seen other utilities plans at the Florida Public Service Commission where, they're recovering from everyone, but again, a targeted group. So yes, I apologize if I made the government pays seem like kind of an indiscriminate, everyone's going to pay. The government does have some control over who's going to pay, but the one thing you don't have any control over is that the people are going to pay for it. That's why I said the policymakers, all they do is decide how and when.
Okay, we got another question too in the chat room.
Great.
Can we consider communications as economic infrastructure from the operator's side, while social infrastructure from the consumer's side?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that's why I said the line between economic and social infrastructure is certainly blurring. I think the thing you're going to run into is typically when we're thinking about economic infrastructure, we're thinking in terms of a user pays type of mechanism. Um, and again, 5 years ago when we were thinking about infrastructure, it was really a pretty bright line in that economic infrastructure was always user pays, social infrastructure was always government pays. Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at the communication network and you're looking at the ability to charge for that service, which would be more consistent with a user pays mechanism, but then with an understanding of what happens when affordability is an issue. I think that's where and certainly the person who asked the question, they're free to unmute themselves and chime in. But yeah, I think that's one way of thinking about it is say, right, we're allowing for then the communication network provider to charge, but we still have to figure out what happens if we want people to have access, but affordability is an issue. And that might be where, say, that funding gap comes in. And now you have to make a decision on how do you go about closing that funding gap. But yeah, that's a great consideration.
Okay, we have a couple more questions too.
Sure, great.
What are some good ideas? Oh, hold on one second.
Uh-oh.
What are some good ideas for learning citizen infrastructure priorities?
Yeah, that can be challenging because you ask people if they want something, the answer is always yes. Hey, do you want a high-speed rail line that runs between, Orlando and Tampa? And actual initiative we've had here in Florida. Every couple of years you'll have people standing on the street corner with petitions and saying, sign here if you want a high-speed rail line from Orlando to Tampa. And they get thousands of signatures because sure, everybody wants it. A different question though is, are you willing to pay for it? And that's where the part comes in. So yeah, figuring out the value of infrastructure is always tough. I think a good first step though is looking at, what are the costs of not having it? So if a particular area, doesn't have a hospital, as an example, what does that do to the healthcare costs for those people locally? If you have data on what people spend to, find their healthcare solutions elsewhere or education solutions elsewhere, that's a pretty good first step. Now, people may be willing to pay, a bit more than that, to have the infrastructure locally. There may be some things that you don't take into account, but certainly the first thing I would look at, and maybe this is a bit of an economist bias here, is what does it cost the people to not have the infrastructure? Because if you simply go by, do you want this? The answer is always going to be yes. The question really is, what are they losing by not having it? And if you can get a good answer to that question, I think you're a long way there. But certainly public engagement is key. Talking with people, having forums. I went to a couple of years back. We were teaching a course in Uganda, and one night in the hotel there was a big meeting talking about a road project in Uganda, and that was great. I mean, you wouldn't think that a lot of people would come out and talk about a road project, but there were a lot of people there. And I heard some really interesting stories and some, great back and forth from different folks about, why the provision of that infrastructure, maybe didn't do such a great job, how it could be improved in the future. So, stakeholder engagement type forums, I think are great, but ultimately you have to be able to separate the idea of, what do people want, and then what are they willing to pay for it? And getting that second part can be pretty difficult, but engagement is definitely key.
Okay, this is, I think, more of a comment. In a resilience policy and plan, there could be a fund created for damages caused by a natural or human disaster so that access within society is fair and sustainable.
Yep. You know, you may run into some issues with the fair part. You know, as an example, and Florida's not alone in this, but there are lots of utilities, you know, here in Florida, we're one set. I know the Caribbean is another set. We get hit by a lot of storms. We get hit by storms to the point that insurance companies don't really insure utility infrastructure in Florida or in the Caribbean or in parts of Central America. And so they create those funds to, you know, to ensure that there is some way for utilities to recover the costs to build the system back up. But here in Florida, everybody pays into that fund. The trick is the entire state doesn't have the same susceptibility to hurricanes. You know, there are some parts of the state that get hit with hurricanes a lot more often. There are other parts of the state, mostly the Northeast, that don't get hit by hurricanes very much. But everybody pays. And what sometimes comes up is the idea of the fairness. So certainly a fund like that, where you're, you know, you're providing for a cost that may not be recovered elsewhere, certainly checks all the boxes when it comes to sustainability. You may still get arguments for fairness, but, you know, I think that's a perfect example of a tool that has advantages and disadvantages, but, you know, in the right context, can be a very valuable tool.
Okay, another question here. On the COVID debt example for utilities, what would be the other avenue for mitigating those costs instead of spreading over the rate base? Just sunk costs? Is the value of maintaining the financial health of the public utility enough to justify a spread of cost over an entire rate base?
Yeah, that's yeah, I mean, and this is I want to stress this is very much a work in progress. So, you know, I gave an example of a couple of tools that are being implemented, but they are by no means the entire story here. This is still something that lots of utilities are working on. So, I had some ideas when this was starting out going forward, you know, how this was going to look. And some of my ideas I think have been borne out. Others, so, you know, some things I found surprising for me. So let me share a little bit some of the stories that I've seen. I've already talked about the creation of a regulatory asset and some of the problems that leads to. People asking questions, hey, wait a minute, you know, my bill just went up by, you know, 2% or something, but I paid my bills during the pandemic. So, you know, why am I being asked to pay? There are some that have looked at, rather than creation of a regulatory asset within the utility system, have looked at the idea of securitization. So in this case, it's the government that is basically paying the debts and then accounting for, and then basically securitizing that debt, you know, selling bonds in order to pay that. So now, instead of a situation where you have the ratepayers paying, now you've got the taxpayers paying. Remember what I said, though. I mean, there's still, you know, I understand these are different flavors of the people are still paying, but that's one of the big lessons here. People always pay, always will. So what you're doing is you're shifting that from utility customers paying to the taxpayers paying. But the idea is that now the amount of that debt is getting kind of lost in, you know, the overall finances of the state or the city. So it's a way of making it less visible, but the people are still paying for it. So you haven't gotten away from the people paying for it because you never will. But maybe if it's less visible, then people won't complain about it. That's the thinking behind it. Another interesting thing, we had the US government, like a lot of governments I know, went through some economic stimulus measures where they were basically distributing money to be used for certain purposes. And in the United States, a lot of those purposes were infrastructure support. What I saw a lot of municipal utilities, so state-owned utilities, in the US, what I saw a lot of them doing was taking some of the stimulus money and using it to displace other spending they had in place. I'm not doing a very good job. Let me talk specifics. So the stimulus money had a specific provision. You couldn't use it to, let's say, pay down a utility customer's COVID debt or to make up a budget shortfall of some sort for the city. You couldn't use the stimulus funds to do that. But some cities were looking at it and saying, we've got this project here where we were going to replace these water mains. And that was in our budget for this year. We can use the stimulus money to replace those water mains. And now we can take that money that was freed up and we can do whatever we want with it. And some of the cities went through and then used that money that they were freeing up from the budget and paying down utility-related debt. Every state-owned utility in the United States pays some sort of transfer to the general fund. So here in Gainesville, our local utility, GRU, every year they make some sort of general fund transfer to the city government. You saw a couple of cities going to the utility and saying, instead of your transfer this year being $40 million to the city's general fund, only transfer 30. Use that 10 million to pay down some of the debt. So you're not getting around the people pay part because you never will. But it's been really interesting to me the number of innovative solutions we've had to deal specifically with this idea of the COVID-related debt.
Okay, a few more questions.
Sure, great.
What if the asset is built and 5 years later there's a better option? Should the new option be built or should you continue with the current asset? In the first case, would the customer not end up paying more because of the stranded assets?
Yeah, that's always, when we're talking about infrastructure frequently, we're talking about assets that are going to be around for a long time. And in the face of rapid technological change or societal preferences, the way people use the infrastructure, to the extent that you can, you want to try to account for that when you're building the asset. But a better option comes along. You've got a difficult decision to make. Some assets you can repurpose. Some assets maybe they could be used to serve a specialized group of folks. Here in Gainesville, we have a power plant that is solely dedicated to a healthcare facility. And the infrastructure exists for, in the case of a storm or, some other disruption on the grid, that basically that power plant and that healthcare facility, they can both be cut from offline and they form kind of their own microgrid. And in that way, they make sure that that facility never loses power because they've got that power plant backing it up. So sometimes that infrastructure that maybe you thought was not needed or obsolete, it can be repurposed for something else. But if it's a case where you've got this new asset that does the exact same thing, would otherwise replace it, if you've got a stranded asset, going back, and I hate to keep saying it, but it keeps being true, the people ultimately pay all of the costs. So you may be in a situation where, you know, the new bright shiny thing comes along and you can't take advantage of it because you don't have the optionality in the original project. But the lesson in that is, you know, can you build optionality? So, you know, some great, you know, examples I've seen where in terms of power plants, where you identify a need for a power plant, you know, a certain amount of generation, but you can do like a modular build. So, you know, you build part of it today with an idea of in the future, we'll build another part of it, but you have the option to not build it if it turns out that something better comes along. So, but yeah, if you built it and now you're faced with a newer technology that's going to completely replace what you've got, you're going to have stranded assets. And again, the people are going to pay for it. You know, whether the you know, the government you know, continues to fulfill the contract, the original contract, or the people keep paying the user fees associated with that original project. You know, you just have to make the decision, you know, when we're making a decision to build this new infrastructure, are we taking the existing fixed costs into account? You know, what costs exactly are we displacing? And it might be that this new project completely displaces just the operating costs of the old asset. So, you know, maybe it's worthwhile, you know, that the savings from this project, you know, avoiding just the operating costs of the old asset makes it worthwhile for the people. And yeah, you still have to pay the fixed costs for the structure itself, but life cycle, you know, total costs still might be less. But that's a pretty rare case. Yeah, stranded costs are never an easy issue to deal with, but keep in mind, the people are still paying them.
Okay, this is more of a comment than a question.
Sure.
But infrastructure transcends regional boundaries, and referencing Bonnie's comment above about resilience, the actions of the many, often larger and wealthier countries, affect the few quite profoundly. So maybe time for discussions in the global context are in order, where the costs of not attending to those global infrastructure matters has an economic impact on those larger countries. For instance, increased climate events in the Caribbean aren't seen as an issue for the US because, well, it's not the US, but there is a cost. Look at the cruise ship business as a small piece of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the biggest challenges we face is assessing costs across political boundaries of some sort. You know, when we look at you know, in electricity, and you know, I apologize for using a number of energy related examples, but you know, I mean, that is my primary focus here at PURC. Whenever we're looking at building power lines, you know, high voltage transmission lines across geographic boundaries, the biggest problem we run into is assessing costs across geographic boundaries. Okay, there's a reason why the West African gas pipeline, the project, there's a big reason why that project took 25 years. It didn't take 25 years to build. All right, it only took a couple of years to build the pipeline. What took a lot of time was figuring out how you were assessing the costs, you know, between Ghana, Nigeria, and the countries in between. You know, that was it. I mean, and that's one of the big problems in infrastructure is how do you assess costs across boundaries? And usually it's through some sort of agreement. The problem is, though, one of the countries or a group of the countries usually have a lot of leverage in that agreement, and it always causes problems. So yeah, it's the comment is spot on. The problem we run into is just we don't have a clear-cut mechanism that we've been able to rely on as far as assessing costs across geographic or political boundaries. And until we have a mechanism like that, we're going to keep having these problems.
Okay, still a few more questions, Ted.
Okay.
How do you address infrastructure development in sparsely populated communities, particularly in developing countries, where the number of residents don't support an economic case for the infrastructure investment?
Yeah, classic case of the funding gap. And actually it's, and I think it's in broader issues when we're talking about extending communication networks into underserved areas right now. So, I know in this case, the commenter's probably talking more about the electricity grid, but I think the communication networks is an equally relevant problem right now. But it all comes down to, that funding gap. How are we going to close the funding gap? Do we have a situation where, it's a kind of an everyone pays? Sometimes there are network benefits to, extending service into other areas. If you have a large amount of fixed costs on the grid or on the communication network, you get additional users, and now you're spreading those fixed costs over a wider user base. So, you can get effective savings for people who are already on the network. So it's definitely worth studying that and looking at, well, yeah, maybe like all of the costs of extending the network can't be borne by these underserved areas, but are there benefits for people already on the network? And I've seen studies of the electricity grids where there are benefits, where you're taking those fixed costs, spreading them over a greater user base, and it does ultimately lead to savings for people already on the network. But if you can't find savings like that, you're back to the question of how do you close that funding gap, and what mechanism are you going to use? That type of everyone pays, how do you parse that out? But yeah, very relevant question.
Okay. And then I just want to let everyone know that we will be emailing the slides to you after the session. So
yeah.
That was a question that came up. Here's another question for you, Ted. PPP has been considered as one option to develop where governments do have lesser ability to finance larger infrastructure. But the paradox is cost or affordability or lesser economic sense to the end user. Because of this, many developing country, India, has recently slowing down on use of PPP. In this case, what would be the right approach for filling infrastructure gap or infra gap?
Yep, and that's exactly that question is exactly why I said when you're starting the procurement, you got to know what the public option is. Too often I see, that basic idea that, well, we know the public option is off the table, so let's look for something else. And you think that saves time, because if you don't take the time to assess the public option and go right to what you think is the better solution, that you've saved something in the process, but that it also costs you something in the process, and it leads directly to those types of questions. We've got the P3 in place, or we're considering the P3 in place, but now we've got affordability questions, and so you have to ask, whenever we're talking about affordability, relative to what? Relative to the government providing that infrastructure instead, relevant to not having that infrastructure at all. Which is the best option here? And so if the question is then, well, actually, when you look at it, it costs the people a lot less to not have the infrastructure. Well, then maybe you don't need it. Maybe it doesn't belong. I know that's, for a lot of folks, you might look at that and say, no, 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 we want the infrastructure. But since ultimately the people are paying for it one way or the other, you really have to look at that. That's why I like when I first said the benefits of an infrastructure gap. Some of you, I may have gotten some raised eyebrows. I don't have cameras on here, but that may have made a couple of you sit up. You have to be thinking about that. Sometimes the best solution for the people is not providing the infrastructure, and they go on doing what they're doing. But you have to have a sense of that. And so, don't fall into the trap of just because we want it, that necessarily means it's sustainable going forward. Because, if you spend something, if you spend on something that people don't need or aren't going to use, that still causes problems, because they're all still paying the cost for it in the end. So that value for money proposition becomes critical. You have to understand those choices, public procurement, and then the cost of not procuring. And ultimately, you're looking at what represents the best value for the people going forward.
Okay, so I know we're going over time a little bit here, but there are still a couple more questions.
That's fine.
Okay, we have seen the importance of infrastructure. If the infrastructure for water distribution is worn and outdated, how does a government deal with the total restoration of the entire infrastructure?
Yeah, and that's a great example of dovetailing on the last question. People are paying. People are paying for poor service for the water, whether they're paying in terms of what they have to do in order to get the water. A number of you, especially if you've been involved with PURC any amount of time, you've certainly heard from our director, Mark Jameson. And Mark can tell you stories about when he was a kid, and they used to have to drive into town to get the water for the farm. And they drive into town with a truck, and they pick up the water, and they'd come back and they put the water into their storage stuff. I mean, it cost them to not have water service out to the farm. And one of the things that his father did was organize basically a cooperative water utility, and established a cooperative water utility so they didn't have to go into town and get the water. So the people are paying, either in the access to water. If it's also coupled with sanitation, then there are some healthcare costs in there too. So not having the infrastructure, people are still paying. So, if you can alleviate those other costs and establishing, mitigating that problem with expenditure on the water infrastructure, it might cost less to repair that infrastructure than the cost that people are already paying. The thing you're going to run into is that people see that their water bill is going up, and they say, oh, look at that, my water bill is going up. You point out, well, but you're spending a lot less on healthcare, you're spending a lot less on transportation, you're spending a lot less on other costs. Yeah, but my water bill went up. Someone's got to be there to explain that in the context, they're better off. And you have to be ready to do that. So, that's the first thing is, understanding what is it costing people to not have that infrastructure in place, and can you put that all together? But that's a challenge, because people just focus on, look, my water bill, and don't necessarily think in terms of my healthcare costs went down, my transportation costs went down, all these other things went down. I have more time now because I don't have to drive into town and get water. But someone's got to make folks aware of that. That's where the value proposition comes into play. But then, once you've established that there is value in putting this project together, once again, you're left with that question, is it user pays or is it everyone pays? And there may be that, improving healthcare in this region, helps everybody. So there's a valid case for the government saying, you know what, we're going to put, government money into this project because it has benefits for the citizenry at large. So there may be a user pay element with the government closing the funding gap. But it's still got to be that understanding first, that life cycle view of what are the costs of having this infrastructure, of not having this infrastructure, and then making the decision on how the people pay and when, because one way or another they do.
Okay, and then I believe we just have one more question for you.
Yeah, and then, I also want to say, I think maybe that should be the last one. I notice folks are dropping off here. But if you're sitting there and a question comes up, tomorrow or next week or whatever, come on, you know where to find me. I could, if I could point you to resources or whatever else. But really, really appreciate all the feedback on this. But yeah, Blair, let's get somebody the last word here.
Okay. Do you have any experience whereby communities are building their own infrastructures, especially telecom infrastructures?
Yeah, that's that model. I don't know the history of cooperative utilities in a lot of other countries. I know that in some of your countries, it's very new. Where was it? Bangladesh. Pretty sure it's Bangladesh has seen a rise in electricity co-ops, over the last 5 to 10 years. In the United States, cooperative utilities started I think in the 30s, where folks that weren't close enough to cities to be served by municipal utilities, or in areas that investor-owned utilities didn't deem profitable, so they didn't serve. Folks banded together, and they formed their own. They basically formed their own utilities, and the U.S. government in 1931 created a federal agency to help them to do that. Because you get a bunch of folks, they may not have the technical expertise to set up a utility. So that kind of got it all started. And while water utilities and electric utilities get most of the publicity when it comes to cooperatives, telecommunications is also, there are plenty of examples of cooperative telecom utilities. And yes, you're starting to see a lot more talk about those types of utilities. So in the United States, the government has a dedicated federal agency that can offer technical support, that can offer loans. They don't do grants. Well, they do grants in certain situations, but for the most part, they offer loans. So it's actually a moneymaker for the government too, where you have groups of folks in underserved areas who basically form their own utilities, and then they govern themselves. They elect a board of local folks who are now responsible for the utilities policies. They're responsible for rates. And so here in Florida, where we have a number of cooperative utilities, the Florida Public Service Commission, our regulator, has some control over what those utilities do, mostly in cases where they interact with other utilities. But for internal governance, for things like rates and rate structure and everything else, the utilities are responsible for themselves. So you get, there's value in having that autonomy. You determine what the rates are going to be, but there's also responsibility too. there's, there may be some outside support from the government, but ultimately you're responsible for providing the service. So yeah, really interesting model. We haven't seen a new cooperative utility here in the United States in probably 20 years. But I'm starting to hear a lot more chatter, not only here, but around the world of, cooperative utilities for, telecom, which is something you don't hear that often. So yeah, very interesting case. But again, with that autonomy comes responsibility.
All right, that was it for the questions.
Thank you, everybody. Those are great. Well, I guess we'll wrap up now. I just wanted to extend a thank you to everyone for sharing the last hour or so of your lives with us. This is a topic that resonates with a lot of folks. As I said, there are a lot of challenges in infrastructure provisions. There are also a lot of opportunities for us to do some really interesting things. So while I don't expect the problem to ever go away, it's really interesting to me to see the new and innovative ways we're coming up with to address the issue. And I think with good thinking, we will continue to come up with different ways. And boy, anytime you have a story to share, we always like to hear it here at PURC. As I said, where to find us. So thank you all for your participation today. I'll turn things back over to Blair for a couple of housekeeping notes. But I hope you all have stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope that we get a chance to see you all soon.
Thank you everyone for joining. I just wanted to let you know, look out for an email from me. I will email you the slides of the presentation this week. And then once the recording is available, we will email that out next week. And again, if you have any questions, just contact us. Thank you.